To paraphrase Hunter S. Thompson, when you get locked into a serious beer collection, the tendency is to push it as far as you can.
Cheers.
Son of a bitch! Give me a drink! One more night! On this camping thing! Son of a bitch! If I drink it clean, I'm gonna drink my life away.
The Tap Takeover Podcast exclusively uses the Physics draft beer system to dispense all of the beers we review. Physics utilizes sonic wave technology to create the ideal density microfoam head on your beer. It delivers a fresh from the tap draft beer experience that you can enjoy at home or on the go with no need for any external gas or additives. Just 4 AA batteries. Physics, tasting is believing.
Welcome back to part 2 of our Cicerone episode, our home brewer interview series. We're here with Dave Olson from WisconsinBreweriana.com, and we're going to continue the train here with some new beers. We're going to get a little deeper into Dave's cellar collection. We're going to talk about the history of brewing. We're going to talk about the history of beer in Wisconsin. We've got all kinds of interesting information for you, and the reason that we did a part 2 episode is we learned some lessons from episode 3. We know that drinking that many beers all at once in one episode may be a little too much for some of our listeners. So here we go with part 2 of episode 5.
All right, let's talk about the beer we have in our hand right now. Andy, what do we got?
Starting off, episode 2, we went with Urban Decay by Dark City Brewing Company out of New Jersey. And it's an Imperial Stout that was aged in Cabernet barrels.
This intrigued me when you told me about this, and you definitely get that wine taste.
Yeah, the wine really dominates this beer. You get a big wine nose, a lot of grape, and ton of oak. I get so much oak, which I'm enjoying. The nose is,
it's a consistent though, in the front end and the back end. It's not like you don't get any.
It smells.
It's kind of
almost reminiscent of a sour.
I get that as well.
That's the grapes. But yeah, it has a nose like a sour, which is really off-putting because then when you get into it, there's no sour flavor at all. It's, I guess off-putting is the wrong word. It's just, it throws me off.
Dave, what do you think?
Yeah, I get a lot of that Cabernet and oak off the floral aroma here. And when I chew a little bit of this in my palate, I get a little bit more of that influence from the cask.
Oh, I got to try the chewing.
A ton of oak. I mean, there's so much oak. I know, is this aged again in oak barrels, or is it just...
Nope, just straight Cabernet barrels.
All right, wow.
Yeah, I don't get too much like vanilla or any of those kind of oak notes, but you definitely get the wood from the cask.
And Dave, for our listeners, could you describe that chewing method again? What is that process that you're describing?
What I'm describing is, in my mouthful of beer as I taste this beer, I'm using my tongue to push the beer up to the roof of my mouth, almost like you're chewing something in your mouth. And basically you're just exposing a little bit more of all those taste bud receptors in your tongue. For me, it helps connect the dots occasionally when I read the label and I don't taste what the label says.
All right, when we ended part 1, Dave, you were talking about the reasons why you were collecting. You got into it with your dad, and you just picked it up back in college with some pieces that you found. Now it's grown back up again. What specifically stands out for you? What do you like to collect? I guess any wheels for you as far as like collectible pieces? Do you look for bottles? Do you look for old cans? Do you look for... There's great tins hanging up.
Yeah, so one of the focuses of my collection is that it's got to be Wisconsin stuff. I prefer the breweries from around Wisconsin, small towns that are defunct now. Don't think people appreciate the depth of how many towns around Wisconsin had breweries. Also, right here in Milwaukee, one of my whales, one of my favorites is the Falk Brewing Company. And that is the only history I have on my website right now. But the Falk Corporation, which has now been bought out by Rexnord, the great-grandfather, when he moved to Milwaukee, he started a brewery. And his brewery was right up there with Miller. It was actually bigger than Miller at the time. Blatz, Pabst, and Schlitz. He was one of the big 4 or 5 brewers in Milwaukee's brewing legacy. And in 92, his group sold out to Pabst, which put Pabst over the top as far as capacity, but also as far as accounts. The Falk Brewing Company, and you'll see some cards on my wall here, had accounts throughout the West. They even had accounts in Mexico. Some of those trade cards are written in Spanish, which is really cool. I think the history of brewing in Milwaukee is overlooked by all of us. As we walk around to all of our favorite locations here in Milwaukee, we don't realize that some of these buildings we're passing by, there were breweries there. One of my friends and mentors has documented well into, I think, over 118 breweries that existed in Milwaukee at one time. And obviously, if you think of the ones you can name in one hand, there's a lot more breweries out there that you're unaware of. So connecting the history to brewing is one of my passions. And I think whenever people get me going over a few beers like we are today, I could talk to you guys indefinitely about Milwaukee's brewing heritage and Wisconsin's brewing heritage. At one time, our big breweries were globally the biggest breweries in the globe. So,
It's weird to think about it, right?
and what's left over there, like if you go to Schlitz Park and you go and look at the Aurora Healthcare building and drive down this really long, like it might be 100 yards long building, that used to be the bottling house for Schlitz, okay? And if you look at the volume of that building, so MSOE has taken over some of the Blatz Brewing building. One of the bottling buildings is MSOE's biggest building down there in that area.
That's a Milwaukee School of Engineering.
Correct. I actually started a brewery history tour company last year, and unfortunately I chose a poor weekend, Memorial Day weekend, for my first inaugural tour. And I had difficulty getting a tour group together, but I was modeling my tours after Discovery World's brewery history tours, and my partner was Len Jorgensen, who is also Discovery World's historian. I really would like to, in this year, through my website, through maybe your podcast, teach people about some of the brewing history in Milwaukee. I think it's a great opportunity for people to learn, and you're all into beer anyway. I think it's a great story, and if you like history.
The stout we're working on is really warming up now,
And I think a lot of those flavors and notes are really starting to pop for me. What do you guys think?
These type of beers always take on that complexity once they get a little bit warmer, you know?
Yeah, this stout's definitely warming up.
Yeah, it mellows out. A little bit drier.
Now, Dave, you were saying about that you knew about the history of cans or bottles. What were you saying? That
I'm sure. So let's talk a little bit about the history of cans. Post-Prohibition, there was a company out there you may have heard of, American Can Company, I believe. And
my grandfather worked for American Can Company for 30 years.
Jim.
Well, you don't need it.
so you're gonna
This
really
time,
like this.
This time Jim's putting his grandfather over. We'll
Putting
allow
himself forward by proxy. Anyways, go ahead.
it. We'll allow it.
So at the time, they were canning food, right? And at the time, you look around my collection here, you see a lot of wood beer cases up against the wall and a lot of really heavy brown bottles. Brewers were shipping beer in kegs and in bottles, and in those bottles, there would be 24 or 36 in a case. It was very heavy, and this company decided to work with a small brewer out east. Opening up the very first beer can advertisement. They partner with Krieger Brewing out on the East Coast.
What year was that?
So this is about 1935, 1936.
Oh, wow.
Wow.
And Krieger was a small brewery, let's say it was approximately the size of Lakefront. And they said, hey, we want you to be our test case and put your beer in our cans. And Krieger went, yeah, we can't afford that. And they said, no, we'll set you up with a canning line. We'll get you all set up. And one of the catchphrases in this advertisement is, half the weight takes half the space. So if you can imagine, you're making thousands or hundreds of thousands of bottles of beer. If you could save half your shipping cost, what a financial gain that would be for your profits.
There's such a chain reaction of weight because of fuel, there's so much stuff tied to that.
And those kind of dynamics even mattered back in 1935.
That's amazing.
So these guys said, oh, well, you'll set up that canning? Sure. So the first 6 months that they had started canning beer, their production went up 60%. And the big guys like Schlitz and Pabst went, whoa, this can thing looks like it might be working. And it wasn't that this Krieger Brewing Company was a threat to them, but there was a lot of truth. There was no more deposit, no more returns, no broken bottles. Remember, when you brew beer in bottles, you have to buy the bottles before you can package it. And broken glassware or glassware that was never returned to the brewery was a cost to the brewers. They set these cans up from the beginning to be lined, just like our modern cans are today. Lined cans protect the beer from the metal. You know, they were 12-ounce cans, and they had to teach people how to open these cans. So if I pull one of these Pabst cans from 1935 off my shelf here, I'm going to pass it around with you guys. You'll find it has opening instructions. And the very first cans produced, here's an original opener that would have went with it, have how to open a beer can on it. So I'm passing this beer can, and it says, quite frankly, this is how you open this. And if you can imagine that, and it has a punch top opener that went with it.
So it's a lot like the old juice cans that we used to get back in the day, where you had to pop it open.
And the next thought on the topic was...
Now, who was the first big guy to get into it? Or they all kind of jumped on once they saw that?
Pabst and Schlitz are really the first two early adopters after the Krieger. And there were several breweries out east as well. Now, this can is from Gettleman, which is another Milwaukee brewery, but you'll notice the top, I know you listeners can't see this, but the top has got a cone. It's literally called a cone top. So Pabst did a flat top where you had to hand open it. Schlitz did cone tops really early. They didn't make a flat top because they were trying to purvey a more classy, it's just like a bottle, but it doesn't take up much space.
It's kind of like a can with a mouth like a bottle.
Is the
it's
top,
even got the pop top.
Yeah, is the top exactly the same size as a bottle? I mean,
yes, and it has a bottle cap on it,
right,
as you can see. One of the early hurdles to getting the public to adopt canned packaging is they thought it was kind of classless. Okay, so Blatz and Schlitz had these palm gardens, these classy pre-Prohibition era, extravagant. They made beer to be, as Miller's slogan, the champagne of beer, right? Mm-hmm. And post-Prohibition, adopting cans, people wanted to have their beer out of a glass. And having a cone top that looks kind of like a bottle, but had some of those qualities that they got from canned packaging was something that kind of worked its way out.
Like a gateway beer.
Basically.
Now, from your collection, I can see that you don't have too many of those.
Well, I don't specifically collect cans. So earlier in the previous podcast, I mentioned my father and I sold our collection.
Right.
We probably had 200 different cone tops. This particular one my father-in-law gave me. Now, he was a plumber, and he was underneath a building here in Milwaukee, and he found this. Wow. Never been outdoors, but it wasn't, it's not in perfect condition, but it's a great example of a cone top. It even has the original cap. But the premise of beer cans was really a marketing effort and a cost savings effort for the brewers. And as you're aware, every single brewer on the planet adopted cans, because losing the bottles and the cost of shipping bottles and weight of bottles was just a no-brainer. Same thing with our kegs. They went from wood to steel to some aluminum to aluminum. Today, I think I've even seen polymer kegs from some brewers.
Wow.
It's really fascinating the way that history repeats itself. The fact that many of these brewers avoided going to cans because people wanted the fancy beer in the bottles, and Miller back in those days was considered fancy beer. So you wanted the fancy beer in the bottles, and it was tough to get the populace, the consumer, to switch over to cans. But they eventually did. And now you have something where the craft brewing industry started in bottles. Everybody wanted their fancy beer in bottles. I remember seeing my first Dale's Pale Ale and thinking, what the hell is this? This is an IPA in a can? What were they thinking? And now you see cans everywhere. You see Dale's 1050 aged in bourbon barrels in a can. You've got bourbon barrel aged beers in a can. And it's really interesting to see the way that the consumer has again adopted the can as a perfectly viable source for fancy beers.
Yeah, but it's the consumer, but it's also the manufacturer who's doing it for the same reasons.
The exact same reasons. Yeah,
but,
saving a little bit of money on shipping costs.
But Oscar Blues started in cans. They've always been cans.
Yeah, even their tappers look like cans.
The modern argument to me is less about savings and shipping and stuff like it was right after Prohibition. Today, I think a can is more protective of the beer, all right? No light. And it's sealed. When it's filled, it's, completely purged. There's no oxygen, there's no light. Beer in a can today is still protected from the metal, just like it was back in the 30s with a liner, so it never is in contact with the aluminum. It's quicker to chill it down. If you drop it, it doesn't shatter. It's a great vessel for beer. It's just a miniature keg.
So you think that's now why we're seeing the rise in popularity of crowlers?
I guess from my opinion that's more of a gimmick. It's a selling gimmick. No, Jesus, I think that's a spectacular idea if we were to do a segue into worldwide stuff.
Again, my glass has a hole in it, so...
So this next beer we're tasting is out of my cellar, or my boxes. This is Dogfish Head Worldwide Stout, and I would age it, it's not marked, I believe it's about 2009, 2010. This is my favorite Imperial Stout.
Super smooth.
It's a perfect example of those dark notes when you first taste an Imperial Stout aging into like dark berry kind of flavors. It's really uncanny. This does not taste like the same beer that I tried in 2016. This is incredible.
Does it have like a spiciness to it?
It has a huge chocolate floral. And remember, this beer has been aging. It's got great head. It's
amazing.
Got great legs. This is still the beer I say is my favorite.
So yeah, if you're listening and you have the opportunity to grab a couple bottles of Worldwide Stout, throw them in your cellar, age them for, what did we say, about 6-7 years on this one, and they're gonna be amazing.
No.
They're gonna be well worth the wait.
Definitely a treat. Thank you. That was good.
I mean, I get that spice that you're getting from it too, Jesus. It's almost like a pepper.
It's almost on the back. It's on the back end. A little spiciness.
I think that might be, we're coming just towards the peak of this beer. I think this is about as far as you want to age this.
I would agree.
Yeah, I wouldn't push the limit any further.
Yeah,
because
because I'm actually getting kind of a little bit of papery note on the back, and that's start of the back end of aging.
So you think maybe last year might have been the ideal
prime,
year on this one? Well, that's good for our listeners to know as far as how long they're aging.
I've always loved their description on the label. A very dark beer brewed with a ridiculous amount of barley.
Yeah, I mean, it's still boozy. And we've talked about a lot of the stouts, how when they're very fresh, they're boozy. And on the nose, behind the chocolate and behind the notes, there's a lot of plum, raisin, and booze.
Yeah, it's interesting. Aged this long, it almost gets into barley wine territory.
Exactly. Yep.
There's a really beautiful sweetness behind all of those malt notes that you won't find this in the first 3 years of this beer.
Well, let's get back more into Dave's knowledge here.
Well,
so you told us about the can, but you also said you some knowledge about the history of the bottle too, right?
Yeah, actually. So we picked up on the can history post-Prohibition. This idea to get rid of these heavy brown bottles and heavy wooden cases that they used to use. But if you take a step back in time, shortly after brewing started in Milwaukee, let's say that was approximately 1841 to 1850, most beer was put in kegs. If you were a saloon owner, so one of the bottles that Mobcraft found in their construction was from a former saloon owner, you could buy some beer and repackage it in bottles yourself. So the first bottles were sold not necessarily to brewers, but to saloon owners and people who wanted to have some kind of package sales. The very first beer bottles, especially here in Milwaukee, looked like this. And this is a stoneware brewing bottle, late 1860s. And it looks like what you would imagine a stoneware bottle looks like. It's a pint-sized volume. It's very robust. One of the reasons these still exist for guys like me to collect is because of how heavy duty they were made. At the time when they would rebottle some beer, or maybe you were a brewer and bottled your own beer, it had to be robust enough to take the pressures of carbonation, because at that time there was still basically bottle condition.
So this bottle would have a cork, or what would this?
Correct. The first beer bottles were corked because they knew from wine and champagne that they could cork, and the shape of the top of the bottle typically had an edge that a wire bail could help hold that cork in. The problem with the pottery bottles is if they dropped, as you can see on this example, they would chip. So once you chip the top, the bottle couldn't be used anymore by the brewer. He'd have to dispose of it. A lot of these, the brewer never saw again, but again, the cost of doing business was to invest in these bottles. So the next bottle that I wanted to show you guys, and for your listeners, I'm just going to describe it, is called a Hutch. And it's a very short, pint-sized bottle. It's got a very robust, hand-blown, really thick glass, like I'd say at least 1/4 of an inch thick. And if you guys hold this and pass it around, you'll notice at the bottom, it has kind of a hexagon or octagon face. And if you look carefully at the lettering that's embossed on this bottle, it'll say John Groff. And John Groff is widely known in Milwaukee as being a soda manufacturer. But very few people know that early in his timeline, he also produced Weiss beers.
Well, it was, I believe it was around Prohibition when he switched over to soda production.
Correct.
In
As
order to
of
stay in
Prohibition, he quit making Weiss beer. He had a Weiss brewery and a soda brewery. And one of the things in early Milwaukee bottles is, even if the bottle's clear, which usually means it's not a brewery bottle, if it has that octagon or what they call a mug base,
Yeah, that's what I was wondering.
it is actually likely that it's a Weiss beer bottle. And then if you further read the embossing, it actually says John Groff Brewing Company. We know that example is a Weiss beer bottle. And carbonation is why they hand blew these and made them so robust. Did you have a question?
Yeah,
Is this-
what? So you said it's a Weiss bottle, but
So
I don't understand why the shape.
The shape, that mug base or octagon base, was how they would distinguish what's going into what. So they bottled mineral water, they bottled soda, they bottled birch beer and other non-alcoholic drinks, but they put beer in these octagon bottles.
So
And
instead of
there's
a label,
Yeah.
it's basically denoting what's in the bottle.
That it's beer. It's beer in the.
Correct.
Wow. Okay.
So how was it open? It was opened by punching
Yeah,
in?
so in this particular example we're passing around with you guys, there you can see some wire. There's a wire baling, and then the idea in this particular example was that the wire pulled the cap up into that. That's called a Hutchinson. And Hutchinsons were mainly made for mineral water and water. And you remember Milwaukee had access, like in Waukesha, they had access to artesian wells. Even where the Pabst complex was, when Pabst first chose that location, it was because of a huge artesian well. And the Pabst brewing production actually sucked the well dry. But these Hutchinson bottles are real early in the bottle timeline. 1850 to 1870, you had pottery bottles, and somewhere in that range, 60, 70, 80 to the 90s, there's some Hutchinson bottles and other glass bottles that were produced. People figured out that brown bottles protected beer better from being light struck. And we started to get to a bottle like this. This is called a blob top.
I'll tell you what, before we get to the next bottle, let's crack a bottle. How about it? What's taking over the tap here, Andy?
So it's the Unibrew Grand Reserve 17. So it was bottled in 2015. It's a dark ale, brewed with spices and aged in French oak barrels.
Belgian style. Absolutely Belgian style.
Yeah,
Sure.
yeah. The
Right
esters
off
are
the bat.
really coming over the nose from the yeast, the Belgian style yeast.
Excellent head on this beer. Really lacy, and it's... Did you physics this?
No.
No.
It's
This was just straight a hand pour.
Yeah, this is, you get that Belgian lace head on it. And
beautiful.
The retention was
It
fantastic.
is. I'll tell you what, when it first came out of the bottle, there was a bit of a copper kind of taste that is dissipated as it's warmed up, and now it's fruits and berries and just
yeah. So I think similar to wine, where you really want to keep beer protected from oxygen, but when you open it up, you do want to get a little bit of oxygen in there in order to start to open the beer itself up. And I think that's where some of that metallic taste has dissipated because it has oxygenated a little bit.
So Dave, lend your Cicerone-Server skills to this. What are you getting out of this beer?
Well, Jim's comment reminds me that putting the beer in the right glass sometimes increases your experience. You know, we have tasting glasses here that are in just a little flute kind of shape, but they're not necessarily the right beer for this Belgian ale. Maybe a better tulip glass with a stem. Opening up to the oxygen or aerating the beer and getting that sensory, you know, if you're really going to enjoy your craft beer, getting the sensory part of your aroma is absolutely key to the taste and how you experience the beer. And it sounds kind of beer snobby, but with the smell, what I'm getting from this particular beer, it completely fits the standards of a Belgian strong ale. And I get a little bit from the dark fig and the deeper taste in this beer. I always smell it first as much as I can to get a little bit better experience.
Yeah, fig, plum. Those are some of
Any
the
dark kind of fruit.
Yeah,
is
raisin. There's some really nice flavors going on.
Hey, it's a beautiful brown color.
Speaking of raisins, I think that Raison Detra Extra should be our next one.
I want to follow up with the whole glass thing. How much do you prescribe to that as far as like the different glasses for beers?
So the glass is not going to change the experience. However, even though we kind of said that, the nose is going to change the experience. So whatever glass you're working with, if you're not actually smelling the beer first, a short sniff and then maybe a big deep inhale, you're not going to have the same taste maybe as what the brewer intended. I firmly believe that. If you're not introducing sense of smell into your tasting experience, you're missing out on a lot, not just some subtle. If a glass has a tulip shape like your standard sifter does, it's taking a wider at the base and concentrating the smell into a smaller, enabling you to take a greater whiff. If you're just using a small, 4-ounce taster glass, it's already a concentrated sniff when you're trying it.
Yeah.
We were talking about cellaring too. This one actually has right on the bottle, Best Buy 11/30 of 2020.
Oh, see, that's interesting. Wow.
Because it actually has a cutoff. Because we've always been wondering, like, when does it turn?
Yeah, we've talked about that. Different methods of measuring when a beer's good, when it should be drunk. I guess it's a little bit easier with the Belgians because they've been experimenting with these yeasts for so long that I think at some point, you put this yeast in a bottle, this is about the year you want to bring that sucker up.
Again, I don't want to get too sidetracked, but do you think that's more of a marketing thing? I mean...
Well, first of all, they may have made the beer in the past, all right? And after trying it a couple of years old, just like we tried my Worldwide Stout here, and it's pretty old. And when we decided it's probably on the fringe, per Jim's palate, he can detect it's starting to be on the fringe of being good. I think any brewer who makes beer that's to be cellared has an idea from their past experience what the sweet spot is. I've had some Alaskan brewery beers. I can't remember which style offhand, but we tried 2 years old, 5 years old, 8 years old, and 2 years was the sweet spot.
Wow.
And I think quite a few beers, the brewers have already experimented. One of the things I picked up from your podcast with Russ Klisch that I thought was really interesting is the Wisconsin Brewers Guild wants to put that hourglass logo on labels. And I think that's a brilliant idea. That might differentiate Wisconsin's brewers in the short term until everybody does that. So you actually know, if I buy 2 of these, I can enjoy one now while it's fresh, and a year from now or 2 years from now, I can try it again and have a different experience.
Yeah, it's awesome that you bring that up because that's actually been one of the unifying themes in some of our podcasts. The reason that we went to Henry from Mobcraft for our third brewery interview series was because Russ and Jim had talked about Henry as the not the person who came up with the idea, but the person who came up with the logo on that cellar aging icon. And I think that's a big theme throughout our podcast is the cellar aging programs, the cellar aging process, and the cellar aging collections that people put together. So let's get into another beer from the cellar, and the Raison Nestra I think is up next.
Actually, Alex, it's pronounced Raison Detra.
And this is Raison Detra Extra, which means it's the cast-aged version from Dogfish Head, of course.
And it's brilliant. Even though we were a bit concerned that it might be a little too aged, I think we've hit the prime spot here. The bouquet is fantastic. There's multiple notes of florals and fruit and raisins.
It's got a color like a candy raisin almost.
It's got a nice ruby.
I can't describe it anything else than just super smooth.
Yeah.
It is just so smooth.
It is
Kudos
an
to
aged
Dogfish.
beer. There's not much head to it anymore, but it doesn't take away from the flavor.
It's like liquid Belgian candy for you homebrewers.
Absolutely.
It's just that color, and it is
it is very
alcoholic
sweet
and boozy.
Hit-
The legs
Sweet,
on it, when I
huge
roll
malt.
it in my glass, are just spectacular.
Has anyone ever had one of these fresh? I have not.
No, this
Nope.
is the first time I've had it.
This is the only bottle I've ever seen. I bought it, and I decided to sit on it for a special occasion.
And how long have you aged this one for?
I'm going to guess this is also from the 2011 period.
2011. Okay.
So 5-6 years easy.
I don't believe I can drink this beer again unless it's been aged 5 years.
Yeah,
Yeah.
no,
I
it's
believe I've been spoiled now.
It's really
fantastic.
I don't know that Dogfish Head has made this since this edition.
well,
I feel like
they
you've
should,
wasted
'cause-
this beer on us. I'm sorry. I'm really sorry.
So
I don't.
Like many of your listeners, I would rather share one of my good beers that I know is going to be a good beer with people who appreciate it. And I think it's fun for us to taste this and experience it together because I'm going to remember it. It's the only bottle I've ever owned.
Yeah, it's an
I'd
experience.
rather share with you guys and know that you appreciated it than I just like sucked it down while I was watching the news. That's not the right way to do big
This
beers
needs
like
to be
this.
made into candles.
Right?
And I think that's really one of the fun parts about the podcast and why we started out doing this is not just to experience great beers, which we do, but we could do that and not record it. What we're trying to do here is we're trying to record these sort of experiences. Beers that the general public just can't get. If you at least have the experience of other people experiencing it, flavor wise what you're trying to get into. Just spiritually what you're
Well, I
trying
would
to
say
get
it's
into
almost
with
like
these beers.
you say the taste of the beer is the smell, all this stuff, but it's also who you're with.
Exactly.
It's like you remember all this stuff.
We're just trying to raise awareness for our listeners because, honestly, I mean, none of us will taste anything like this ever again. Huge thank you to Dave for sharing something like this that's not going to come around again.
Yep, beer's better with friends, and I'm glad to share it with all our friends.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
And I appreciate
Really
you
good.
gentlemen
Cheers.
giving me the chance to share this because I absolutely love the fact that my investment in this beer, and it was an investment, it was to be enjoyed, and we're enjoying it. So cheers.
Yeah.
And
Cheers.
now it'll be
Cheers.
forever recorded in history.
And I would like to read for your listeners the label. Again, one of my favorites is to read Dogfish Head labels. So this is a bulbous brown flavored ale that was brewed with boatloads of big raisins. They do not have a ABV listed on the bottle.
Good for them.
It's up there.
So if you want to get back to the bottle, we discussed stoneware bottles, and we discussed the Hutchinson, this kind of like hand-blown, super heavy-duty bottle. And then we start making our way, let's say late 1870s, 1880s, into different versions of brown bottles that we recognize today. The first ones were hand-blown. There were several glass companies in Milwaukee that used to hand-blow bottles. And the first renditions of these bottles had what they call blob top. So this is all pre-bottle cap. And if I pass this bottle around, what we're observing is this bulbless top. And just like today's modern Belgian beer bottles, it had a lot of extra glass on the top so they could cork this bottle by hand and then put like a wire bail on it to keep that cork from blowing as the bottle conditioned. Again, this is kind of pre-pasteurization, so bottled beer is still bottle conditioned in the early use of bottles.
When this bottle was out, is this the only variation? So when I would buy this beer at this time, this was the only type of bottle top? Or how many, you know what I'm saying, is as the transition through the years.
All of the brewers were trying new things. One of the dilemmas they had is after this bottle conditioning happened and we had carbonation in the bottle, it was hard to keep that cork from blowing. So after the corking bottle was perfected, we started working with blob top bottles that had baling wires. So if your listeners have ever seen a Grolsch flip top bottle, or homebrewers who have bought flip top bottles, I'm going to pass this around. This is a Falk Young and Borcott bottle. If you drop that, I will cry on your podcast. I weep, and I'll probably swear too.
So I got a question for you. So the blob top, obviously it's a heavier at the top. Is that sort of to balance out the weight on the bottom of it too?
It's really to give an anchor for a baling wire, or just
It was
like
specifically for the bottling cork. For the cork.
just like today's baling wire that we took off that Belgian.
Yeah, that corking cage.
That corking cage is what I'm calling a baling wire. It's a little extra anchor that's strong to not let that cork blow.
Now, I have trivia for you.
Yes, sir.
I was actually at the Corbell tour in California, and they were explaining the turns, 6 half turns.
Excellent.
It's always 6 half turns for that kind of cage.
For the wiring, for the
and
the
I
cork
have no
cage.
idea why. It's just an old French thing.
I appreciate learning something new about the twists in the bales, because I've always wondered why they're there other than ornamental.
What's really cool about this next bottle, just looking at it, is the amount of craftsmanship that has gone into it. You can tell it's not a manufactured bottle like we would see today. It's actually got the lines. It's got the dimples. It's actually got little air bubbles in it. You can tell that that's hand blown glass.
Yes and no. So this bottle, we're going to bring it back to you so you see the seam.
Okay.
Was actually probably hand blown, to your point, but into a mold.
Okay.
And if you see the seam on this bottle,
It definitely does have a seam.
it brings us to the discussion of manufacturing of bottles. Brewers had to invest money in raw bottles if they wanted to sell bottles. So they started to label their bottles. Well, paper labels, as you know, come right off a bottle. Pow. So these bottles we're passing around are all embossed with the brewer's name. So every brewer has bottles, and you may even see on the bottle the words, "not to be resold." And it was so that they could get their bottles back. And as we mentioned earlier when we discussed the history of the can, broken bottles were a loss of revenue. Cans, on the other hand, which were much cheaper to produce and support, they were regaining those losses. This next style of top, you can see the shape of the glass still looks like a blob top. And a blob top, just to refresh everybody, still looks like maybe one of your Belgian bottles that had a cork in it. It has that thick glass top, so something could clasp. But they started to work on these baling wire, like the Grosch baling top. I'm not sure why I should have moved that. That's over 150 years old.
Yeah, don't break that.
Who knows what kind of air is coming
it's still
out
in
of
one
there.
piece, thank God. But as we exit the era of blob top bottles and different types of closures, I don't know if you guys are all aware, but February 14th was the 125th anniversary of the patent on the crown, or the bottle cap.
Really?
Oh, wow.
So you can find bottle cap looking bottles going back just before Prohibition. And here's a bottle capper from the Prohibition era when, of course, we started to bottle our own beer. But bottle caps, and I hope everyone in your listening group at least toasts this month. If you missed February, that's okay. In March, you're just slightly behind the times. But in 2017, the 125th anniversary of the bottle cap patent.
Yeah, so if you're listening now, time to toast to the bottle cap.
Cheers.
Cheers to
Cheers.
the bottle cap. All right, well, I think that's a perfect time to jump into the last part of the second segment of this two-part series, and let us do a side-by-side comparison of the two IPAs that we have left. We have the Amber Smash Face, which has been aged a year, inadvertently, by the folks at one of our local liquor establishments. And then we've got the 120-minute IPA, which was also aged
5 or 6 years. At
5 or
least.
6 years, somewhat inadvertently, because you just kind of found it in your
I
stack
may
of
have
boxes.
paid too much for that bottle, so I sat on it for a while.
Okay, so let's get into a side-by-side comparison. So Jim, tell me about these two beers. We've got the Amber Smashed Faced, which is the, what did we say, the aggressively hopped American Amber Ale, and then we've got the Dogfish Head 120 minutes. What are we dealing with here?
Big beers. So the 120 from Dogfish is, what is that, Dave?
18%.
A billion ABV. Yeah, is that?
It's, according to the commercial description, too extreme to be beer. A colossal 45-degree Plato. So it's boiled for 2 hours, so that's 120 minutes continuously hopped. And you'd think with that much hops, it would just strike you as an IPA off the bat. It doesn't. It strikes you like a barley wine.
Especially after this much.
I
age.
thought it tastes like a hoppy barley wine.
Yeah, it really does. You get a ton of the malt. It's very malty forward.
What year are we talking about here?
It's
What
6
year was
years
this
old.
put away?
I put this away probably, I would say 2009-ish, 2010.
Okay.
Yeah. So
It's not It was before they started dating the bottles.
Though on the label it does say it ages well, which is
It does say
not
ages
what
well.
we
That's
expect out of
surprising.
IPAs.
But
At 18
This is
plus
the-
percent.
Yeah.
This is the exception to the rule.
if there's everything that falls into the barley wine ABV range, this is at 18%.
Yeah. I don't know if I was a BJCP that I would consider this an IPA, right? I mean, it blows the style guidelines out of the water.
If you guys chew, do that little palate trick I was talking about earlier, the 120 is super complex.
Mm-hmm.
And I when you sniff it, you smell a little bit of the alcohol, but it's not in your face. It's
That
not
technique
hot.
really
It's
just adds another level to your
There's
taste.
not a lot of hot in this. At 18%, do any of you feel that this is a hot alcohol
I'll,
beer?
I'll
not
tell you
hot
what,
at all.
when I do the chewing method, I get heat. That's
Yeah.
when I get the heat, but that's the only time.
But you get
If I'm
to-
just sipping this down, it's very, very subtle.
You just get an explosion of flavors, though, too. You get that heat, but there's so, like you said, it's so complex. Everything that's exploding in your taste buds.
Yeah, what are
When
you
you
guys
do that-
tasting? What are we tasting here?
I'm tasting a big sweetness.
Belgian candy almost.
It is. It's an expression of the malt of the beer. The hops, if they were there, they've kind of gone over the years at this point.
I just taste the hoppy barley wine.
Yeah,
Yeah.
malts
To me,
have-
that's the best way to describe it for me.
the malts have coalesced into
Yeah.
sweetness. I don't know if you get. I'm sure you guys have had a 120-minute IPA from Dogfish Head.
Yeah.
First year that it was made, and it's super hoppy, obviously, but the malt backbone it's almost over present. The malt backbone is kind of a driving force behind that beer, just to be able to handle that much hops. I'm sure a few years later it's going to be super hoppy, and we're talking about a few years after that. And this is just, it's sweet, it's malty, but on a different sort of level than you're talking about when you first taste a beer, first year out. It's very complex and very different.
Yeah.
So speaking of aging, too, I mean, it says right on the bottle here from all those years ago, right?
Yeah, it does.
Aged for a decade or so.
People
Age for a decade or so.
used to see Dogfish Head 120 as the holy grail, like Pliny the Elder. A beer you almost can't get. My more recent acquisitions of 120 have happened at Woodman's. So if you think you can't get 120, it's no longer true in Wisconsin.
You can get it every once in a while. Yeah, it's crazy.
Now,
I see
do
it
you have to be
there, so-
paying attention and make a few trips once in a
Of
while?
course.
Yes. This particular bottle, I've been sitting on it for a long time, just hoping to share it with some like-minded individuals. What I understand from the commercial descriptions is 18 to 21% ABV. I think if you drink the beer fresh, which I have done with my Woodman's purchase, it is a very hot alcohol. It's still delicious. We have proof in our hands that if you let this age for a while, it's just a different experience. It's completely off the hook for quality.
Yeah, we've talked about beers that can be cellared, and really the minimum is 8%, and here we are at 18. That's kind of over the top for alcohol. They've really got to work hard to put as much grain in it to
But it's
produce
always
that much
but
alcohol.
it's still weird because go higher alcohol, but not. But I always thought hoppy beers you don't age.
It's ridiculous.
You don't.
Yeah,
This
because
is-
it's the two things kind of crossing each other.
This is still hoppy. That is ridiculous. to me.
Very subtle.
It's
in the
very
hoppy.
subtle, but
It's
I
subtle,
just
yeah.
took
Still
my
there.
very last sip,
Yeah.
and it was hoppy. It was hoppy, goddamn.
This has a smoother, more of a Belgian strong ale kind of flavor and mouthfeel. I can detect a little bit of hop. Very, very subtle. If I didn't know it was a 120-minute IPA, I would be hard-pressed to call it an IPA.
No, you would
That's,
never.
yeah, that's a
Yeah,
good
no.
point. Yeah.
Yeah, it definitely is not within the style guidelines of an IPA. Even triple IPAs don't push 18%, so I'm not sure what you would even call it, but I mean, it is really verging on a barley wine.
And on that note, what would we say are the style guidelines for an amber smashed face? An amber ale that's been hopped to hell and back again, and then aged for a year in a cooler, which is going to slow the aging process to a point. But this tastes very different than it did a year ago. I remember trying these, straight out of the bottle back last February. Delicious. One of the best reds I've ever had because it was crazy hopped. Andy, I know that you've tried the Amber Smash Face fresh out of the bottle before. How has this one changed?
I'd say it's smoothed out a ton. It really has. It just punched you in the face and kind of blew up your taste buds at first, when it was fresh out the bottle, when it just came out. This is, a lot of the floral notes have opened in it, and it's smoothed out a lot.
As I taste this, I'm starting to taste a little bit of degradation, so I think it's peak.
I
don't think I would take this particular bottle of beer and go any longer. How old is it again?
It's a year. A year and about 2 weeks.
I think that if it has a sweet spot, we've got there.
Okay.
I don't think this is like a 2 or 3 year old sweet spot.
I think the smell is also kind of...
It has a little cardboardy almost kind of oxidation is the classic cardboard.
No, I picked this up back in December, and I think that may have been about the perfect moment. I opened one of those bottles, and it was fragrant in a certain way that I had not expected. It was floral. There was a real sweet spot there. Maybe that was the tail end of that sweet spot.
It's definitely still a tasty beer.
Yeah, you still get... I also had to ask if this was made with fruit, because I get a huge apricot on the nose.
Yeah, no, not made with fruit specifically, but I think they're getting a lot of fruit flavor from those hops, and from the red malts as well, from the caramel malts.
I think both. It's a really great observation. I'm going to guess that one of them is Simcoe, because I'm just getting that heavy piney smell and fruit, and that to me says, now we could not look up or discover what the actual hops are. But I'm going to say one of them's got to be Simcoe in this. But it's very fruity. But yeah, we were hitting it.
Yeah,
again, this is actually one of the beers.
That's a fair assessment. The Simcoe, I think, makes a lot of sense in this beer.
It's got to be drunk fresh. So if you have one, drink it now or wait till the next release.
Well, here's the thing. I think this may have been a one-off. I have not seen it since. They did not make it this February, so
it's one of their one-off.
That may have been a one-off.
One-off band
beer, right?
Well, if you have one,
no, this was not even a.
Three Floyds does those band collaborations, so it's a one-off collaboration that they did with a band.
Okay.
So it was a collaboration with Cannibal Corpse, which I think is more about the artwork than it is. Exactly. Well, the label than it is the beer.
It has a beautiful label.
Three Floyds are they're a death metal band, and that's the Cannibal Corpse is a death metal band. Three Floyds is into death metal, so they do a lot of collaborations with heavy metal or death metal bands. And it's Cannibal Corpse is sort of an in-your-face, punch-in-the-face band, hence the name.
Well, I think that about does it for us, boys. That was 2 amazing beers to finish this 2-part series off with. We've had a great time with Dave Olson. Thank you so much for inviting us into your beer
John,
cave.
my pleasure.
Welcome back anytime, man.
And I think that'll do it for us. So for myself, Alex Kuhn,
Dave Olson,
Jim Anderson,
Andy Kamoski,
Jesus Naval.
I don't believe we have any more beer, boys.
No more beer. No more beer for you. He said there's no